Is the Greek crisis for you economists a test tube case, a case of experimental economics?
I think I would say that the euro area as a whole is a test case. We've had a situation, you very rarely get clear-cut tests of fiscal policy because governments rarely make large changes in fiscal policy. In this case, we're seeing big changes because of debt fears, austerity, so it has been an unusually good example. It's not pure experiment, obviously. It's not a clean experiment, even in those terms, and obviously there's a lot of things that matter. But no, I will be dishonest if I didn't say that one of the very small side benefits of the crisis in Europe has been that it gives us an opportunity to test economic theories.
Does that mean that economists are possibly a good advisor to government or a less good advisor because they are so much interested in the experimental side of it?
Well, I can't think of anyone who has advocated a policy because he thought it was a good experiment as opposed to because he thought it was a good policy. And let me say that the results of the experiment have sadly rather strongly confirmed the theory that many of us went into it.
How do you evaluate the policies of the now resigned government of Alexis Tsipras since the last general election in January?
Well, the trouble was that Tsipras staked everything upon being able to get a better deal from the Troika. And then when the Troika refused, he was unwilling to take another step. There was no plan B. So if you had told me in advance that what he would do would be to create an air of crisis and then when actually faced with the refusal of the other side to give any ground, completely fold, that was not positive. The end result was that there was a period of disruption that I think is probably less important than people think, but still there was a period of disruption that hurt the economy at least a little bit, and nothing was gained.
And how do you assess that cost to the economy? You said not as bad as many people think.
Yeah, available data suggests that the economy did not contract as much as many of the horror stories suggested, and for what it's worth, those effects will fade out quite quickly now. So there are people with a great interest in exaggerating the damage that was done. Greece was not, in fact, on the road to recovery before the Syriza took power. It was showing a slight upturn, but it was nothing like a real recovery. So if you think that everything would have been fine without this confrontation, that's wrong.
It did have a couple of positive quarters last year.
That's not surprising. I mean, from the beginning, we always said that if a country did austerity for a very long time, it would eventually have deflation sufficient to make it more competitive, and there would be a slow comeback. But
isn't that the question? Competitiveness?
Well, you have to be careful about what we mean by that. So I do not, if competitive means, if when you say competitiveness, you mean that, oh, there can be no recovery until Greece has German levels of productivity, that's nonsense. It's not really about the loss of, about productivity. It is about, in this case, just if you have a depressed economy, yes, wages will fall slowly over time. You will become a cheaper place relative to the rest of the euro area. So that we expected some recovery in all of the austerity countries eventually, but not much. And the trouble in the case of Greece is that although there are some underlying positive forces just from falling costs, the demands for ever greater austerity are frustrating the possibilities of more than a minor recovery.
What is the difference between Greece, that has not reached a recovery on the one hand, and other countries like Spain or Ireland or indeed Cyprus that have achieved that recovery?
The main answer is that although Spain imposed a lot of austerity, it was not nearly as much as Greece, and what's more, it's not continuing, it's not ever harsher austerity. Spain cut, but then the cuts more or less leveled out, and that's as the economy began to recover from that point. In the case of Greece, every time there's a glimmer of hope for the economy, the demand is raise the primary surplus by another 1%, 2%, 3% of GDP, and that means no recovery. So if you look, almost all countries that have started a recovery, they have not reversed past austerity, but at least they've stopped imposing more. But Greece is under demands still that it have ever more austerity. Now, there are other things. There has been a puzzling weakness. Greek exports have not risen as one might have hoped. So I will not deny that there are some structural...
Yeah, I mean, there are some structural questions like production and exports, and Greece seems to be in a dire position of having to restructure there in order to become more... No?
It would help. But the notion that Greece is so fundamentally flawed that it cannot have an export recovery, this would be something new in the history of economics. Demand curves slope downward for all countries. It's still the case that making Greece a cheaper place to produce, a cheaper place to visit, has a positive effect, and Greece has its own strengths. So you want to admit that there are structural problems, but those are not an excuse for the poor performance.
So what is the extent of what is the importance of structural change? What are the real needs for structural change in the Greek economy, in your view?
I would come back and say, look, Greece has labor productivity that is substantially below the EU average, which means that unless that can be changed, it will have, even in the best of circumstances, a standard of living that is well below the EU average. Greek wages cannot match German wages or even average EU wages as long as it's a low productivity country. But that's not a reason to have 25% unemployment. That's a reason to have somewhat lower wages. And it's the lethal effects of the euro and of the austerity policies that have made it so bad. I do a comparison now. I'd like to compare Greece with Poland. Poland is a low productivity country, lower than Greece according to most estimates, but it has not had a crisis. And the fundamental difference, surely, is the fact that Poland has retained its own currency. It was neither loved so much, there was never the vast inflow of money that took place during the good years of the euro, nor the vast outflow. So you should not, yes, Greece has structural problems. It's a low productivity economy. It should be richer than it is, but that's not why it's in crisis.
How about the importance of the fiscal situation? Greece is much more indebted compared to all the other countries, Spain, Portugal, or indeed Poland.
Right. Greece ran up a substantial debt, too large, should not have borrowed that much. It has now been, how do you deal with that debt overhang? And the attempt has been to deal with the debt overhang through enormous fiscal contraction. I mean, the amount of austerity imposed in Greece has been completely awesome. What would
have been the alternative?
The alternative would have been to get substantial debt relief right from the beginning, to say we cannot solve this problem by cutting. It was necessary. Greece was going to have to run a primary surplus.
Back in 2010, say.
Yes, it was clear that there would have to be a path to a primary surplus eventually, but there did not have to be a path to an ever-rising primary surplus, and there had to be a point when you say enough. You cannot, no one can run a surplus as large as what the Troika has demanded of Greece. And the effect of that has actually been to worsen the debt position, because although the debt grows more slowly, the ratio of debt to GDP rises because the GDP is smaller. So this is it's almost like a Laffer curve. At a certain point, trying to do austerity is actually makes your debt position worse, and Greece is clearly on the far side of that.
What would be the right growth policy where we stand now?
I thought that the proposals that were on the table early this year, which called for essentially freezing the primary surplus at a small amount, 1% of GDP, thereabouts, no further tightening of austerity, and then major debt relief so as to make the debt burden sustainable given that relatively small surplus.
Okay, debt relief is on the cards. I mean, it has been on the cards since 2012.
It's never been remotely large enough. It's never been, I mean, the IMF itself says that under the current plan, the debt situation is not sustainable. Now, the point is that if you could get that, then possibly the fact that Greece has already had so much deflation could lead to recovery. That was the hope. I think that was still a reasonable proposal in early this year. But if that can't be, if the creditors refuse to agree to anything like that, then there has always been a case that says that exiting the euro is a terrible disruption, but once it has happened, then you have the preconditions for a real recovery, and that should still be on the table.
But can you assess the depth and the duration of that destruction in case of a return to a national currency? Because if there is no way to make a safe assessment on that, then there is no way to decide as a voter or as a government whether it's worth taking that risk or not.
I think you have to say it is highly uncertain. There are no good parallels. The closest ones we have are Argentina, 2001, 2002, which still had its own currency, but it was a very disruptive process of de-dollarizing. That was far more successful, far less disruptive than people think. People imagine that there was a sustained crisis there, and there was not. In fact, the economy had turned up sharply within just 2 quarters. So the Argentine example is relatively favorable. The Greek situation, unfortunately, because of the euro, because there is no Greek currency in existence, would be harder. We don't know how much harder. The trouble is that Greece is faced with the choice between a highly uncertain policy, where we know that at the other end, a country with its own currency has many more options than Greece has now, but on the versus a strategy, the strategy that has been followed for the past 5 years, which we know doesn't work, we know will fail. Now, what we would like, if the rest of Europe had any sense of self-preservation, it would actually say, look, here's a different path, a middle path, which is we will stop demanding ever more austerity. We will keep Greece in the euro, but we will loosen the conditions sufficiently that Greece can begin a recovery. But everything we've seen says that that is not being offered.
But in the case of Greece, there could be a question as to whether stimulating demand is the right strategy, because Greece has a trade deficit, it's a net importer, it doesn't produce enough. So by actually stimulating, raising consumption, you'd be just sending the money back out.
But we're mostly talking still about export-led growth. I mean, there will be domestic demand as well. In fact, Argentine case, again, this is as good as a model as we have. Turns out that the Argentine recovery did include a substantial rise in domestic consumption, but also a rise in exports. Greece, look, you have to be careful. Trade deficit is a very bad measure for Greece because service exports, tourism are so important. Still a current account deficit, but not very large. Lots of opportunity. If Greece were cheaper, if it were stabilized, no reason to believe that there wouldn't be a lot of opportunity for growth heading forward. And if we say Greece has structural problems, well, it always did. And it didn't always have 25% unemployment.
Am I right in saying that you are an advocate of the states having a leading role in recovery rather than the private sector?
No, on the contrary. I mean, I would call for an end to state, to ever greater cuts in state investment, but no, I think it would actually be private sector driven. It's important to say I am not a socialist. I do not believe in government control of the means of production or any of that, and I think there are some things that even in Greece the state should be spending money on, but no, the recovery would be about a private sector given a chance to recover because it's not being hit over the head again and again with ever harsher austerity.
But how do you inspire trust and goodwill in order to attract direct private investment from home and abroad if you continue to have those fiscal problems and an underperforming state? So I'm bringing you back to the issue of reforms.
Leaving off the legacy debt, which is enormous, Greece does not have a serious fiscal problem. Right? It has a primary surplus, or it probably does again for a little while. It had one at the end of last year. The disruption probably eliminated, but it's probably back in primary surplus. Who has a primary? The U.S. doesn't have a primary surplus. Britain doesn't have a primary surplus.
But they have access to markets.
Well, but that would be, I think, if one could. This is why you want debt relief, to put a line on.
So that's the key.
Well, no, it's one key. Then a competitive exchange rate if you must leave the euro. And then Greece is Greece is it is not a failed state. Yes, okay, there's plenty of corruption. Everyone tells me that there's lots of corruption. This has always been true. It's not unique. Is it a place where people could make money on investments? Yes, of course. There are Wall Street people out there saying Greece is your best investment out there because it does look in many ways undervalued. So, and it has assets. I'm sorry to say, it sounds demeaning to talk about tourism, but where in the Mediterranean is there this much underdeveloped, wonderful coastline? So, if one could put a line under this debt crisis, I think a lot could happen. Yes, debt relief is an end to the ongoing debt crisis is crucial.
Where we stand now, we have a new bailout in place. What's your assessment? Is it a good thing? If yes, what's the best way to implement it?
A workable strategy has to include two things, at least. If it's possible to make this work at all, you have to have, first of all, a cap on the amount of austerity that's being demanded, not the demand each year that you do even more tightening. And second, you have to have sufficient real debt relief so that one does not have to keep on coming back, where it is not a permanent state of debt crisis. The latest memorandum includes neither of these. It still includes demands for ever greater austerity. It does not provide fundamental, it provides some reduction in payments, but it still doesn't offer the kind of debt relief that would make the outlook looking forward sustainable. So no, I think this is almost a caricature. This is an agreement that is designed to fail.
Are you saying that a prolongation of repayments, a grace period, lower interest rates, these do not constitute enough debt restructuring?
It's not enough. And
you would want a haircut, basically.
I would want a haircut, if only because it's, I think there are, in a real sense, that does provide more debt relief, and it's also psychologically very important. I've studied Latin American crises. There are many lessons in history, and one of the things we learned in the 1980s was that a haircut that is acknowledged, that looks like it's the end of the process, has an enormous positive effect on the whole situation.
But many would say that a haircut in a public debt would be a political impossibility. It would be like calling on a Dutch pensioner to pay for my national debt, and that would definitely undermine European solidarity. Well,
but of course, the truth is that money is never going to come. The reality is that Greece's paper debts are impossible to collect. No country can do the kind of fiscal adjustment that's being demanded of Greece. So realistically, there is no loss for the Dutch or the German taxpayer in all of this. Now, if it's still
there a loss anyway, you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. And much of it has already been capitalized. Now, if you're saying that politically it's impossible to acknowledge reality, then Greece must exit the euro. Because if there's no way within the euro system to get a plan that has any chance of success, this is a dead end.
Okay, and now this brings us back to the national currency debate. You said that it's very difficult to assess the depth and the duration of the impact that a Grexit would have. So let me now ask you, if you were a responsible Greek politician, would you go ahead and make the decision to take the country to a national currency?
What I would have done is, in the days after the no vote, I would not have done Grexit, but I would have introduced the parallel currency. I would have gone for the plan B that was in fact had been worked out with essentially debit card payments as simply to keep liquidity flowing, to make it possible to operate the Greek system without having to rely at every step on the European Central Bank.
So the Varoufakis, James Galbraith plan.
I would have gone that way. And that would not necessarily have led to Grexit. I mean, that might have opened the possibility for further discussion and then a deal with the creditors that was realistic. And then perhaps Greece could have stayed in. But if not, if they were still intransigent, then I would have gone for Grexit, in the full knowledge that it would be dangerous and disruptive, but the path that's currently being followed is guaranteed to fail. This is not going to work.
Is it worrying you that the national currency debate is mainly advocated in this country by the far left? You don't belong there.
Right, I'm not there, and that is a tragedy. I understand, actually, how that happens. I think the power of conventional wisdom is enormous. Been very, very rare for the public never supports a weaker currency, even when it should. But this has been destroying the center left all across Europe. What you have is that the reasonable, the moderate left has been intimidated by the bankers. And so you're left with only the crazy people who I find horrible on other grounds, but they are the only ones willing to actually come out for what is, what may well be the necessary economic policy. I hate that. But this is
Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, Corbyn, yes. Corbyn is certainly not sinister the way the drachma people are in Greece. But he's flaky, no question.
Where do you think Tsipras stands now? Before the referendum, you advocated a no vote, just like Tsipras, but with a different rationale, and Tsipras took a different path. Where do you think he stands now?
I guess I don't know what he is for now. If he is for accepting the dictates of the Troika, are we allowed to go back to calling them the Troika? But if he's for accepting the dictates of the Troika, how is he different from the other parties?